Welcome to the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum. There will be a Q&A session at the end. If you would like to submit a question for the panelists, please do so in the Q&A panel. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome virtually to Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Ted Wittenstein. This is session number 6 of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Cyber Diplomacy, Global Cooperation, and Conflict. We'll introduce our terrific panelists in just a moment. As a reminder, all attendees have their volume and video muted, but we're eager to incorporate your questions. You can submit those using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will record this session and distribute and post the video afterwards for the benefit of everyone. It's hard to believe that we've reached our 6th of 7 bi-weekly Thursday webinars taking place this semester, focused on the theme of sovereignty in cyberspace and bridging the divide among the law, technology, policy, business, and academic communities on the most critical cybersecurity challenges. We've had a great group of Jackson Institute and Yale Law School students who are part of the forum for class, a core group of practitioner fellows. You can check out cyber.forum.yale.edu to catch up on our previous sessions, exploring data governance, criminal law enforcement, defending forward, election interference, and cyber organization and strategy. So our 7th and final session will take place in 2 weeks on April 29th, focused on disinformation and active measures, and featuring our colleague Thomas Reed from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Ona Hathaway is our forum director. She's the Gerard and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law, Counselor of the Dean to Yale Law School, Director of Yale Law School's Center for Global Legal Challenges, faculty member at the Jackson Institute, and our key partner in putting together this great forum. She's joined today by Michele Markoff, Deputy Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the US State Department. Ms. Markoff is an alum of Yale's Graduate School and Political Science Department. Since 1998, she has been the Senior State Department subject matter expert responsible for foreign policy initiatives related to cyberspace. And in that capacity, she helps coordinate US policy on the full spectrum of cyber-related policy issues, developing diplomatic strategies to encourage states to cooperate and build resilience and protect critical infrastructure. She's also been the United States government expert on 5 groups of UN government experts devoted to cybersecurity. These have led to important consensus reports regarding norms of state activity in cyberspace, and I suspect we'll talk more about that today. Alexander Evans is a member of the British Diplomatic Service. Normally, I'd say he's joining us from across the pond, but he actually just landed yesterday or this morning his time in Pakistan, where he's on a special temporary assignment as the acting UK Deputy Chief of Mission in Islamabad. He recently served as an advisor in the Prime Minister's office in London on foreign policy and national security affairs, including cybersecurity. And prior to being appointed to 10 Downing Street, Alexander served as cyber director from 2018 to 2020 as the UK's lead cyber negotiator, working closely as a counterpart to Michele. And he has served as Britain's deputy and acting high commissioner to India, among other senior assignments. Alexander is a former Yale World Fellow and a senior fellow at our own Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. And I believe he is 9 hours ahead of us at the moment. So thank you so much, Ona, for moderating. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Alexander, for being with us. I'm going to let Ona kick off the session. Remember, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, which I will help moderate later in the conversation. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Ted. Thanks, as always, for your partnership. And I'm just so excited to have Alexander and Michele here with us today. This is a topic near and dear to my own heart, so I'm excited for our conversation. So I wanted to start off, Michele, by asking you to say a bit about kind of how we got where we are. So obviously we want to talk about where we are and what's going on, but I think for students and viewers who may not have been sort of following this along, you've been involved in this for a very long time. I wonder if you could give us kind of the history of cyber diplomacy, kind of what kind of has led us to the moment we're at, what kinds of focus has the negotiations through the UN had, sort of bring us a bit up to speed and kind of what cyber diplomacy looks like, how it got started and how we got where we are.
I'd love to do that. It's a very long story. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. I would only want to point out to our participants that today, with the White House's public attribution of identity to Russia as the perpetrator of the recent major SolarWinds hack, you have, with all the other partners and allies of the United States, including quite prominently the UK, an example, a very good case study of what exactly cyber diplomacy has become in the current moment in the United States. And indeed, diplomacy is obviously a country representing outward its national interests and trying to shape the international environment in which it operates for any number of reasons. As far as the history is concerned for the United States, it seems, I was thinking about this, it all really coalesced in 1998, believe it or not. There were two seminal events. The first was that Richard C. Clarke, Dick Clark, who is well known to many, who was in the White House at the time, had commissioned a report from a group called the Marsh Commission that basically outlined that the United States needed to wake up regarding information and communication technology and digital things, which we were becoming increasingly dependent upon. For those who don't remember, 1998 was almost pre-World Wide Web. There was a lot of Unix still going on, a lot of quilled pens in the State Department, which made the issue even more kind of tangential to normal diplomacy. But Dick started working on that, and he issued, or the president issued at the time, 1998, something called Presidential Decision Directive 63, which basically said, turn the ship of state around, you better start paying attention to this. But it was all domestically oriented. There was one single line in that document that said, thou shalt go out and make nice with like-minded and friendly countries. Why was I involved? I come from an arms control background. My expertise at Yale was as a Sino-Sovietologist, focusing on decision theory approaches to the acquisition and use of nuclear weapons, deterrence theory, arms race theory, all those things. And I spent the first half of my career negotiating nuclear arms control agreements. But I became passionate about computers in the late 80s and early 90s. Unlike most of my diplomatic colleagues who knew nothing about the subject. So I had that background. And then the other key event, which was the catalyst for all of the rest we'll talk about on cyber diplomacy, was ironically the prescience of the Russian Federation, who came into the first committee of the United Nations, which is the International Security and Arms Control and Paul Mill Committee, where state-on-state conflict is discussed, and proposed a resolution in the fall of 1998 to ban the development, deployment, and use by states of what they called information weapons. And that included, at the time, the way we all defined it, information operations, everything from electronic countermeasures, ironically, to propaganda, to digital means, all as this spectrum of things which constituted information operations. And I, who resided at the time in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs and was the only one who understood what a computer was sent to do battle with the Russians. And that's where it all started. So I would, I'll stop there. And if you have questions about how we then got to where we are now, I can do that. But I would offer Alexander and others and you the opportunity to ask a question, because the UK was, in fact, a little bit ahead of us on all of this at the time.
Well, that seems like a good opening for you, Alexander. So tell us a little bit about your engagement. You were the director of cyber at the Foreign Office from 2018 to 2020. That fast forwards us a bit to the sort of recent developments in terms of cyber diplomacy, but maybe you could say a little bit about what you were building on and kind of how the UK was approaching these issues during that time.
So thank you, and really nice to join you and Ted and Michele, and particularly, even if we aren't in New Haven or all in New Haven, it's very nice to virtually be back in New Haven. So thank you for convening this. I mean, Michele is the deep expert on this. So I think one of the real pleasures and actually extraordinary values of having a depth of expertise is being able to bring that to bear, particularly when some of the negotiators for other states, and I'm thinking here obviously about the Russians, but by no means about the Russians alone, also sometimes have that depth of experience and precedent and nuance. And this is an area where actually strategic capability is really important, strategic perspective and the ability to think long, but so too is really detailed technical and diplomatic knowledge. And in a sense, the sweet spot is merging the two. If I may, let me just sort of add a couple of things, which is just to sort of perhaps talk about where we were in the 1990s to where we may be now. Mm-hmm. So in the 90s, tech was there, but it was fizzy. It was, what you invest in, it was going to change all our lives. We were all going to be super happy and virtual, but not virtual thanks to COVID by 2021. It also reflected a period when the West, to use the shorthand, dominated technology. We dominated technology production, intellectual property, cyber capabilities, and so on. And even in the space of sort of law and norms, a lot of those discussions would take place amongst sort of like-minded industry folk or law professors from places like New Haven and the other place we won't mention, who are going to be of a certain view generally about digital freedoms, about liberty, and about reasonable norms of acceptable behavior. Roll forward to recent years, and I think you're looking at a much more contested terrain. And it's a contested terrain because technology's accelerated rapidly, and this is a sort of strange space for proliferation because it doesn't require necessarily a major state with lots of resource. There's a gig economy around cyber tools. If you're a state actor, you can rent in capability. You can go to hackers. You can go to the private sector. So the speed and potential for adaptation and for actually quite dangerous capabilities by states has just shortened dramatically. And I think you've got to a stage where cyber and tech diplomacy now is absolutely mainstream, even if not everybody's woken up and smelt the virtual coffee on it. And it's mainstream if you think about tech supply chains, the issues around 5G, for example, and Huawei, the issues around national security investment screening, issues around, as Michele alluded to, propaganda and disinformation, but also the fact that a new space has become once again contested and more geopolitical, which is the space of regulatory standards. So a lot of regulatory diplomacy and norms diplomacy, which used to be really important but quite niche, is incredibly material now, and some of it will be utterly material to the democratic sovereignty, the digital freedoms, and the security and prosperity of countries like the United States and other countries like the UK.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, because I think we tend to think of kind of the processes that are happening, the open-ended working group process and the like, is sort of the cyber diplomacy, but this is a much vaster picture of what constitutes cyber diplomacy, looking at kind of the broader regulatory picture, looking at coordination around attribution statements, the like, as all part of this broader picture of cyber diplomacy. That said, what do you see as the sort of central goals now of the US and the UK? And either of you can answer this, whichever order you choose, now in cyber diplomacy. Kind of, it seems like at least the UN process has kind of, if not ground to a halt, not showing a whole lot of forward momentum. So there was the recent open-ended working group report that, at least to my eyes, felt like a kind of we agree to disagree sort of report, but maybe there's more there than I'm seeing. So given that, what are the priorities if that process doesn't seem to be kind of moving a lot forward very quickly? We're seeing more coordination around attribution. You mentioned, Michele, this the recent attribution just today of SolarWinds to Russia and the sanctions the US has put in place. So do you view that as kind of where cyber diplomacy is at this moment, which is not kind of large numbers of states kind of coming together around creating a set of agreed legal norms of kind of treaty making or joint statement making, but much more kind of event-based, particular kinds of narrower topics that we're kind of beginning to make some progress on? Maybe I'll let you try that one first, Michele.
So I, given my long tenure in this, I tend to think of what we are doing as a continuum of US policy, because frankly, I've had my hand in it for 24 years. And so what do you do with diplomacy in a situation like I'm in, where, and the US, we're all in, where there is increasing risk to our nations due to our increased dependency on a particular technology? How do you reduce risk using diplomacy? So as I said when I started, was the Russians thought that they could reduce risk by an arms control approach. Well, we fought them on this for a number of reasons. I don't have time to go into why this is not susceptible to arms control, but it's not. But I will tell you our wake-up call that we needed to be very proactive in trying to shape the global environment in which we operate came after the Russian attack on Estonia in 2007. And it became clear that it was not enough to simply say no to the Russians. We didn't want to engage with them on this. But what we needed to do, and given my background, what we needed to do was borrow from the long experience we had had during the Cold War of mitigating risk by putting state behavior into a framework of acceptability. What does that mean? It meant that one of the things that the US could say about its activities in cyberspace was that it was entirely observant of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, the UN Charter, and international law writ large. That, of course, diminishes the vulnerability or the scope of targets that could be considered to be appropriate, at least above the threshold of the use of force, for in any type of conflict, number one. The other thing that we borrowed from our long period of dealing with our key adversaries was this notion of confidence building measures, that we had a technology with unique attributes. It was not observable. It was not countable. There's no Jane's Book of Computers that you can look and say, oh, that's a Dell whatever, and that can do this type of damage. Anybody can. By the same token, this technology was not only not owned by governments, it turned out that 16-year-olds were probably better at attacking things than people in uniform sitting in military offices. So the question is, what with those unique attributes, and if you're facing a situation where you feel as a nation increasingly at risk, what do you do? And it's a technology that moves at light speed. What do you do about it? You need predictability as much as you can get in the behavior of your adversary. So what is that? Transparency, publication of white papers, doctrine, understanding the intentions of your adversary so that misperception doesn't create a highly escalatory tit for tat situation. So what we began to do, and what has, and I'm getting to the OEWG, and what has eventuated, I'm sorry, I need context for the history here. And what is eventuated is something that we call, over the period of 10 years and 3 consensus groups of governmental experts, we call the framework of responsible state behavior, predicated on 3 things: the affirmation of international law, the implementation of a variety of CBMs, transparency, collaborative, and restraint, and something that we all introduced in 2015, this notion that while international law gave us tools and rules of the road above the threshold of the use of force, what we were experiencing on a daily basis was chaotic behavior below the threshold. And so what are the rules, people kept asking, that should apply there? And we developed, well, the US developed 3, and the group as a whole developed 11. And that, in the absence, in the vacuum of cyberspace, where there was no other authoritative body adjudicating these things for years, has become the, how shall I say, the touchstone, the maypole, the ethical framework around which states have begun to organize. You asked in your questions to me, why was there an OEWG? Why are there 2 bodies now looking at this? And what was the OEWG really intended to do is another good question. The 2 bodies came out of the fact that the Russian and US relationship is at such a low point that the Russians decided to throw away the work of 24 years and put into a new resolution all the hated pieces that we negotiated away for 20 years and that the West could not accept. It forced us, me, to suggest that we needed another group of governmental experts to continue the work that we had always done together. So we had the 2-headed hydra there. The difference was that the OEWG, to make it attractive to the UN membership, they made it at 193, whereas the group of governmental experts is at 25. And the Russian resolution that created that group was quite literally very unattractive to us. It aimed to rewrite the framework of responsible state behavior. It aimed to promulgate sovereign Russian views on sovereign boundaries in cyberspace, authoritarian domestic policies being universalized and legitimized to suppress free speech and the use of the internet, and to create a large state-controlled regulatory body. So why were we in this? Why did it end up being a consensus report? We had to play. We had to play both defensively, and it's a consensus body, and we were prepared, if we had to walk away. But the fact of the matter, and this is the good part of that OEWG, is that all 173 insisted, well, except Iran, insisted on reaffirming the acquis of the 3 prior GGE consensus reports. First among them, the Chinese, go figure, since they've been trying to walk away from international law affirmation for 6-7 years. Now they were the ones who insisted that the exact words of the 2015 report be repeated in this. So that is the benefit, on balance, to the world community. It reaffirms the commandments of open, interoperable, reliable, not repressive, and other things. The bad parts are they want to promulgate more norms. They want legally binding norms to legitimize Russian, Chinese desires. And they managed to pass a 5-year resolution to continue the OEWG. Culminating along with a variety of other UN body activities in 2025. And if we have time to talk about that, that should be. But now we have our GGE, which is also a brilliant document, I have to say, which attempts to explain the norms and the framework of responsible state behavior and every element for the UN body. That is due to come to a conclusion in May, and there is very little incentive for Russia now that it has its consensus on the OEWG to join us in a consensus on the GGE, which they of course hope would go away. So I'll stop there.
Oh, there's so much there to play with, but I do want to ask one follow up, and then I want to invite you, Alexander, to speak to any of this. But I think it may not be entirely intuitive that one of the last things you said is they want more norms, they want more legally binding norms, and that's problematic. I wonder if you could speak to why that's something that is difficult for the U.S. and I think also the UK to get on board with. If you could just, because that may not be entirely obvious to our audience, sort of why is it the U.S. is kind of resistant to that effort?
You mean the legally binding part or the more norms?
The legally binding part, actually. Well, both.
Okay. Well, the question is, so it comes as no surprise to anybody that the American philosophy around the internet went from wild, wild west to open, freedom, all of that. And the last thing that the private sector, the NGO community, and the government has wanted to do is to overly regulate what has been a revolutionary technology. And the question is, what exactly would you regulate? What they want to regulate is speech and content, right? We're in direct conflict with, with the First Amendment for us, never mind the philosophy of the thing. So, and if it's not an arms control treaty, so one of the problems we had with arms control treaties is if you've got a technology that's not simply dual use, it's quadruple use, and and the emerging technologies that are offshoots of this are coming out all the time. What exactly is it that you would regulate? If you look at the Wassenaar process, where there's been an attempt to do an ecclesiastical regulation of a tiny, tiny bit of offensive technology, the debate that has stymied all of this for several years was, one man's offensive technology is another man's defensive or forensic technology. And so where would we be going with this? And exactly, if the question is, how do we reduce risk? what are the legally binding things that you might do? So you could think in terms of forbidding certain types of behaviors, I guess, between states. But what do you do about the non-state actors that are often paid proxies for the state actors that we can't get a handle on in any case? So, I mean, I could probably spout for hours about how I wouldn't even know how to think about it. But Russia is thinking about it, and we have the third committee, new cybercrime negotiation, that will indeed feed into this, although it will have kind of a law enforcement bent. Believe me, it will bring the state-on-state activities straight into it, starting this summer.
So Alexander, I wonder if you could speak to this, and you're welcome to take up any threads you're interested in, but one piece that I think is at least jumps to mind is that the UK has been, along with the US, fairly forward-leaning in terms of articulating interpretations of how international law applies. So this idea that international law applies is part of the answer, but then the question is, well, what does that exactly mean? When you're talking about international law applies in cyberspace, like, how do you apply Article 2.4 in cyberspace? Does it only apply to kinetic activities or not? And what does norm of non-intervention mean? Do you agree with the Talon Manual's idea of that sovereignty as standalone principle, which the UK, Jeremy Wright in particular, was very clear in giving a speech kind of resisting that idea? So I'd be interested in sort of how the UK is thinking about engaging on these issues, as well as your reaction to any of the great comments that Michele made as well.
Well, look, let me begin with the sort of law and norms part with a careful qualification. I think my worst academic qualification was my undergraduate public international law exam, memory of which I try and block out even today. So I'm not a JD, I'm not a lawyer, not one of those lawyer diplomats who I respect very highly, but I'm conscious of the value of drawing on legal expertise. But I think, just in a sense, echoing Michele's point, there's an interesting debate here about the relative value of law and norms in different spaces. Now, I'm going to be a little bit tabloid about this and just talk about London pre-pandemic. Yeah. We have laws that are not widely observed. There's a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in the area in London in which I live, but is significantly not observed. Yeah, but it is a law. There is no law about which side of the escalator to stand on when you take the tube in London, but there's a widespread norm about standing on one side to let one side walk down. So I think you can have norms that are observed or not observed. You can have laws that are observed or not observed. And this is where Michele's point about state parties becomes so important, which is, how much fidelity would state parties have to legal arrangements that they'd entered into? And how much might you actually have a framework where legal instruments are instrumentalized, either to degrade liberty, as Michele's talked about, or indeed to constrain the sovereign capabilities of liberal democratic states? So I think it is an important and continuing debate, but it's one where it's not a slam dunk that norms are so yesterday and we should all be bundling into law, nor is it a slam dunk, but law is not relevant to this either. And that's why I think this is actually one space where that interaction with academia, with professional lawyers, and with think tanks is actually quite enriching. If anything, because it properly keeps officials on their toes to be thinking creatively about it. One other thought on this, which is, it is important, as Michele says, that we work at the all-state level in the UN General Assembly, because that is the lead governance on this. The Security Council doesn't necessarily have, in certain limited frames, but the Security Council really isn't the lead actor on lots of cyber issues or lots of tech regulatory. But it's also true that some of the time we're going to make progress faster with a group of 10 or 15 or 20 states, or we're going to be able to be more robust about attribution with a smaller grouping of states. And we shouldn't be shy about doing that alongside. So I think you can have the two in combination, a little bit like if we're trying to organize when we get to organize dinners out again and are able to eat in restaurants, it's plenty easier to organize with 7 friends than try to do it with the entire extended family. So that's one thing to bear in mind.
Could I butt in for a
Sure.
minute and
Go for
simply say that there's also another reason. So in 2015, those peacetime norms that we did, the 11, are considered voluntary non-binding. And the framework of responsible state behavior is all of that. It's those who have signed on to the GGE reports or the consensus in 2015 on the resolution that affirmed that states would be guided by those recommendations, and now the OEWG. But it was premature, and I firmly believe it's premature for most of the 193 members of the UN to commit to a legal thing where they don't feel that they even have the capacity to understand or implement. And that's what we are trying to do in the GGE report, is give many of the less developed states the tools, the instruments by which where we describe what the meaning is of the norm and how to implement it. And then part of both the OEWG, a bigger part every year of the OEWG and GGE reports are on capacity building, the precursor to all of effective transnational cooperation. The precursor is being organized domestically and nationally for cybersecurity. They have to understand it. They have to legislate it. They have to have modern substantive and procedural cybercrime laws. They have to have certs. They have to have all of these things. So to me, it's very premature to be considering anything legally binding, except for something like the Budapest Convention, which focuses on the nuts and bolts of transborder law enforcement cooperation.
Yeah, and we heard about that in a previous session. Yeah, go ahead, Alexander, if you want to respond.
Picking up on what Michele says, I mean, I think there's something quite interesting here about for those who specialize on international humanitarian law, and for those who specialize on sort of human rights and digital liberties as well. I think those communities actually have some quite interesting debates and doubts as well about pursuing a single different legally binding instrument, because they see the risk of picking and choosing. But what you have is basically something that in many ways might be used to almost devalorize or degrade some of the sort of foundations of IHL and other freedoms, both rights and freedoms. So I think that's sort of worth bearing in mind. I would echo Michele's point about sort of the democratization agenda, and this is something where I think this has often been a conversation amongst quite a small group of states, and I think what's been really striking in the last few years has been the way in which that debate has rolled out to include a lot more states in the sort of the states that aren't necessarily aligned with authoritarian states, but nor necessarily fully aligned with the traditional sort of, North Atlantic community or like-minded community. And I think that's a very good thing. And to that, on the UK side, we would add the importance of engaging with non-state actors and some other stakeholders. We do recognize that it's a state-to-state process, but so much of this is enriched and challenged and bettered by bringing in a lot of voices into the tent.
So that was actually something I wanted to ask about, how you view the role of these non-state actor groups. I mean, some of it's academics, some of it's companies, sort of, so the quote unquote Paris call that was organized by a number of corporations, particularly Microsoft, an effort to sort of enunciate norms in cyberspace. There's a set of Oxford statements that are really, I think, mostly about interpreting how international humanitarian law applies in cyberspace, but also I think it's kind of progressive interpretation, one might say, sort of interpretation, but an interpretation with a bit of a spin on it, or kind of an effort to sort of develop the norms in a progressive way. Do you view those as positive or as working at cross purposes with state efforts? Are these is something like the Paris Call something that you see as actually helpful in developing shared norms, or is it just kind of so that is a statement so obvious, are the statements like the Paris Call statement so obvious that maybe it doesn't actually engage in kind of any real significant norm building? Does it get in the way? Are they misunderstanding with the diplomatic? So I wonder if you could speak to kind of how that the role of these companies, non-state actor groups, sometimes universities, and sort of trying to engage in progressive development. Is that helpful? Is that working at cross purposes with what states are doing? How does that look from your perspective, kind of working at the highest levels of diplomacy from the US and the UK?
Well, we are fully supportive of what is called multi-stakeholderism, but with caveats as well. We have in many cases, both GGEs, the OAWG, and others gone on dog and pony road shows to various multilateral organizations to hear from everybody, to invite the private sector, NGOs, think tanks, and others, and to invite them to speak their hearts. I do say with a caveat that Microsoft was early and often, let's say, investing itself in getting a seat at the table on norms early on in the GGE process, which as a civil servant and an American civil servant, was fine, except that the only interests it was representing at that time were its own. There wasn't a consortium of others representing norms. Their norms was, okay, governments, do what you do, but don't interrupt our ability to service our clients. That was the norm that they wanted. And, it just didn't have a place. Now you might look at solar winds and say, well, actually that had some foresight about not interrupting updating of things, and maybe there's a place for it now. And of course they have the Tech Accord and other things trying to get others to join with them, and that's certainly important, and we have to hear about it. But we were on such a nascent plane with respect to state-on-state collaboration and cooperation. It was, at the time, not very helpful. And in fact, they did something at one point that I suggested. And I said, rather than focus on things states should do, the governments should do, why don't you tell us what you believe your rights and obligations are as private sector entities who own all the pipes? Mm-hmm. And I know Scott Charney came up with that, but they didn't flog that a lot. But it's there, and I thought that was actually a very good document. And that is something that could bring in a multi-stakeholder discussion sometime in the future. But when it comes to the issue of war and peace, it is very hard, except for having private entities describe their interests vis-a-vis the nation, to really have them dominate these things. And the Paris Call, we are not a subscriber, because it looked like they simply cherry-picked things from the GGE and then added some additional things. And so to me, it was a digression, and it kind of took the attention away from what we were trying to do. So not a big fan.
Alexander, feel free to add to that. And I also want to invite you to say something about on a separate topic, the role of indictments and sanctions. So the U.S. has been using, obviously today the SolarWinds announcement is a kind of key example. The U.S. has been doing a lot of other criminal indictments of both Russians and Chinese hackers, as well as sanctions. And how does that play into this picture of diplomacy as well? Is that part of the process of kind of being clear where the guardrails are and kind of what the limits are, outer boundaries, and some of that's coordinated action, some of it's not coordinated action. So I wanted to invite you to speak to that before we turn to our audience, which is coming up shortly.
Okay, go ahead. Alexander, you want to?
Yeah, why don't we let Alexander jump in on that one, and then if you add, Michele, please do.
Let me briefly sort of touch on the multi-stakeholder and then talk to the sanctions piece. I mean, the multi-stakeholder piece, I personally, and I think the UK government generally, really welcomes a lot of those multi-stakeholder processes. Not every state is as into those, and I'm thinking about actually a range of states across the sort of the middle range of states, but between different actors. So I think it's really enriching. And look, I think there's a bit of a lesson here from a community like Yale. But if you have good ideas, you're open to have them challenged. If you have a policy development agenda, you're open to enrich it. And good ideas are generally made stronger by that cross-pollination. So I certainly found in the different jobs I've done, but in Number 10 and in diplomatic roles, that actually having those challenges are really helpful. Doesn't mean you always agree with them. So I very much agree with Michele that there still needs to be that sort of sovereign choice of that here is a state decision and a state position as distinct from an actor elsewhere. But that's a piece on my. Just to quickly add, we've really grown our network of dedicated cyber diplomats, cyber attaches around the world in our embassies. And the core task, one of the core tasks of them, is to build a Rolodex, get to know the terrain, talk to people outside government as well as in. Because the risk is that you can get very quickly G to G, government to government, to the exclusion of the wider agenda. And I think it's good diplomatic practice to make sure you don't get too locked into that G to G piece, although it's essential. But on sanctions, let me say a brief word and then turn to Michele. I mean, I think sanctions are really important. I think targeted sanctions can be proportionate, evidence-based, and have a material effect. I think what's important to think about vis-a-vis sanctions is it's not just the bilateral effect on those being sanctioned. It's also the signaling effect to a wider community. It's also potentially the deterrent effect to third parties. And a bit of this is speaking to the use of proxies or the use of hackers or the use of commercial companies to conduct harmful or malicious cyber acts. So I think sanctions regimes can be material and useful, but like everything else, let's test what effects are and where they have effects. But crucially, in the European context, a lot of folk like sending their kids to school in European universities, obviously if they can't get into Yale, and they like sending, they like traveling on vacation to Europe. And so on. So there's a material, and they like holding bank accounts outside, particularly outside states where your assets can be seized in slightly more rudimentary fashion. So I think asset freezes, travel bans can have a material effect, as well as the sort of the naming piece from public attributions.
Great.
But Michele, I know that you've been thinking about.
Well, again, I stand back and I look at the continuum of what. I'm a political scientist, framework person. So what happened? So we have this framework of responsible state behavior, and along comes 2015, 2016, we have Sony, we have OPM, we have WikiLeaks, we have the attack on everything, and everybody's in the US is flailing, and there's chaos, and there's no effective response. And everybody says, so what the use are norms if nobody observes them? Aha. So lessons learned. One, all our deterrents are above the threshold of the use of force, and we're not going to put an Alchem down a smokestack for the attack on Sony. Lesson number one. Lesson number 2, we don't have an effective process, this is within the US government, to evaluate the nature of an incident and decide how to come up with thoughtful, deliberate courses of actions. And 2, all of this stuff is happening below the threshold of the use of force, and we don't have the instruments of national power that are modulated. There is no, as Nanki Poo has said, there is no punishment to fit the crime. So in the 4 years of the last administration, through now, we have developed a new strategy with the UK and our like-minded partners that is based in a strategy of ex post facto deterrence based on unified attribution, which you saw today, and as much as possible, a collective imposition of painful costs below the threshold of the use of force. That is what you are witnessing today with solar winds. Many countries, the EU stood up. So we have at least 30 countries already today standing up, and within the scope of their national domestic legal structure and everything else, they have either attributed or simply stood up with us. And to the extent that the EU, with its new cyber toolbox and its new sanctions authority, can join us once they are convinced of the veracity of our attribution and can decide on a voluntary, a non-legally binding but ad hoc basis to impose consequences, there we are. And if we stand up together, what do we get? A bigger defensive surface, less prospects of escalation, less tit for tat possibilities, and a lot of attention. And also in standing together, it's not just simply something happened to the US and they are standing with us. We stood with Georgia, we stood with the Czechs, we stood with Ukraine, we stood with everybody who wants help. We will stand with them. We will attribute if we can, and we will impose consequences and costs on malicious bad behavior where we can. And that's what we're talking about now. And we have come up with what we call a deterrence playbook, a nice, big organizational plan by which we can help our seniors, our uppers, evaluate whether an incident has crossed a threshold of national security concern, what is its essential nature and character, and how do we go about countering it.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Ted, who's going to pose, I can see we already have some fantastic questions, so we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So over to you, Ted.
Thank you, Ona, Michele, Alexander, great conversation. We do have a lot of questions about solar winds, and Alexander, I was wondering if you might just respond for a minute to what Michele was saying about this sort of ex post facto deterrence value of the sanctions. Like for something like solar winds, how do you distinguish the significance of it? So is it the scale of the breach or the data exfiltration or something that might have traditionally been conceived of as, run-of-the-mill espionage? Where does the norm here that's being so violated that requires this sort of global response? Can you just give us a sense of, in your old cyber director hat, how you started to think of these norms as it might sort of scale certain types of malicious activity?
Well, look, I'm not the deep deterrence expert that others are, but as I understand it, the logic would be that what you don't want to do is be very ultra clear about where your line is. Yeah, that underpins, for example, Article 5 in NATO. Because if you're really, really detailed about what the line is, it's like bringing up a kid. Yeah, they'll always kind of right to the line repeatedly, and boy, that's almost going to be a messier situation than dealing with the original challenges. But I think it is important to be evidence-based, to have internal criteria, to be able to consider what the intent is, where you have insight on that, and obviously a lot of that draws on closed information. I think it's really important for sanctions listings, because certainly in the UK system, sanctions listings and in Europe, sanctions listings can be appealed in court or subject to forms of judicial review. So they've got to be legally robust. And that again is where proportionate, targeted, having open source material underpinning those, particularly sanctions listings, for example, I think strengthens the relevance of it. But I think there is a really profound question here, which is a doctrinal one, and it's a diplomatic one. And this is actually where I would argue universities have a crucial role to play, whether one's a pol scientist or a lawyer or an ethicist, which is how do we really think through what deterrence means in cyberspace, and what forms might that take, what is effective, what isn't, and how do we protect against unintended consequences? And there are lots of real world challenges. There is a challenge about misattribution that we need to be alert to, but I don't think it's a challenge that is insurmountable. So I think a bit of this is working our way through. And this is another example of a space where I think there can be a very productive conversation from government to non-government parties. You don't need to spill all the beans on the insight you have within government to have a really constructive conversation about developing doctrine or developing law or developing policy.
Thank you. Michele, you actually referenced a quote that one of our students also picked up in the Q&A about around the time of 2011, an anonymous official saying, if you shut down our power grid, we'll put a missile down one of your smokestacks. And, I was just curious in how you thought about offensive cyber tools, as it relates to diplomacy. Is this something that, backs up U.S. efforts to build responsible norms, or do you view it occasionally as sometimes in tension with how you would build those norms if it's disclosed that certain things are happening that we're not aware of? What is this part of the deterrence package in your view for countering malicious adversaries in cyberspace?
Certainly not below the threshold of the use of force, but I mean, obviously, a lot of the activities of persistent engagement have no lethality or damage associated with them. Certainly, there are probably offensive activities that can reinforce this, but in conceiving of, what we have tried to do as part of this deterrent strategy to deal with the lessons we learned about not having consequences to fit the crime is to come up with vast reams of consequences that can be deployed below the threshold of the use of force, whether it's from from trade to sanctions to so Commerce Department, Treasury, PNGing things, State Department, all sorts of things, so I don't think specifically of the Cyber Command portion as being particularly instructive. If that is a punishment that fits a crime that we need a hammer and a nail for, then that's fine. My problem, quite frankly, is that it seems one of the touchstones of this strategy it has a lot of aspects of it. It has the ability to be timely. We want it to be able to deal with the ecclesiastical standards of use of force attribution that we don't think you need to have in order to actually diplomatically call a state out. So there's lots of things here, but the most important thing when we talk about deterrence per se, and believe me, you know, I have all sorts of deterrence theorists coming down on me hard about you know, screwing up the prisoner's dilemma model and all of that. But the problem is that these below the threshold consequences are not painful enough. They are just not painful enough. We have to figure out, and I thought that, you know, when doing it in a coalition or as a group, which is part of what this strategy is. So one of the strategy, you know, part of it is to have a process and to have consequences. The other part of the strategy is to develop a coalition of the willing that's modeled architecturally on something that you might be familiar with called the Proliferation Security Initiative, right? So it's voluntary, non-binding, it's very agile. We come together as we need to interdict proliferation of fissile materials in harbors, on tarmacs and things. Well, you know, forget the content, but look at the notion of being very agile. And that's what we're doing now. We built a coalition that is ever expanding with the need to, with the commitment that the violations of these non-binding voluntary framework of responsible state behavior, a little iffy there, should result in cost imposition. And going back to Ona's question about legally binding or not, so, you know, and your question, Ted, about which norm was violated. This is kind of like saying that, you know, you violated the principles in the Bible or the 10 Commandments. Nobody's looking at specific things. We're looking at the spirit or the principle of responsible state behavior. Yet over time, all of these principles which countries are referring to quite in a wholesale manner right now, may actually become customary international law over time. But our big problem is the lack of pain in what we can apply below the threshold of the use of force. So if you have any ideas in that area, I am all ears.
Thank you. I wanted to give Alexander an opportunity to respond to that too.
Yeah.
The UK does have a new, you know, integrated review and has articulated its own sort of new offensive cyber doctrines. We have a question here, Alexander, about, again, you know, the norms and whether or not the norms are potentially hindering of any offensive actions that the US or UK may wish to take. You know, how have you thought about or grappled with that question, and where do you see the UK kind of trending in this area?
Well, thanks. Look, a couple of things. I mean, in this integrated review, which we published a month or so ago, you know, one of the announcements was avowing our national cyber force. So there's this capability. I think there's something quite important about avowing. You know, I think accountable liberal democratic states avow capabilities that they have. That's part of transparency, part of a spirit of making sure that you have a stable international environment. We were also pretty clear about some of the ethical guardrails we'd use around deploying it. We weren't necessarily going to give chapter and verse about how it might be used in every instance, but you know, again, speaking to some of that, and Ona, I think that speaks to your point earlier about you know, is it useful to sort of detail out a little bit your interpretation of international law in cyberspace, or how norms might be interpreted in a national context. I think, and we think as a government, that is an incredibly healthy thing to do. It boosts transparency, it boosts predictability, and it contributes to a debate that we hope other states would also feel forthcoming in. So I don't think, I think there's a difference between people who are going to use offensive tools to derail the international order, to undermine other state sovereignties, to interfere with democracy, or to strike at the prosperity or essential services of the state. So I think a bit of this is it's very much back to what Michele was talking about, which is what is responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and how do we continue the conversation that has been going on for a long time, but needs to advance further as well.
Thank you. Michele, we have a question here about non-proliferation agreements. And of course, you have this background and this arms control background that you brought to bear in cyber issues. You had previously expressed some skepticism about arms control as it might relate to cyber, but could you conceive of the norm of not proliferating or people who are not responsible and disclosing accidentally? We've seen all these leaks of sort of offensive cyber tools as an example. Is that an area where you could envision further cyber diplomacy?
Well, the proliferation issue is interesting, and indeed one of the 11 norms of the 2015 GGE report kind of talks about not proliferating something. And it really, we really looked at things like this in the context of export controls and things like that. The problem is all of these, it doesn't really matter whether governments are not so much proliferating things. It's all over the dark web. It's all over, governments do not own, as they would say, the means of production of these offensive tools. And a lot of them are more capable quite outside of any government. So, what I do think matters, and what has bothered me a little bit, is that former military who have these skills, after they leave, go out and sell their skills to countries that, well, we may consider them a partner on some level. It's not somebody, or it's not a country we might want to have these skills and be training others in those skills. So I think there's something there. I am not quite sure how to get a handle on it at this time.
Thank you for that. Alexander, we have a question from our own Alexander Evans at the law school, who's asking about maybe ways outside of or in complement to the UN process on norms that may not be through the UN to build norms. Could you envision building cyber norms or understandings into free trade agreements? I think there were some parts of this in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the US originally was negotiating, or bilateral investment treaties or other understandings. Is there a way to make cyber diplomacy more diplomacy and not sort of cyber in front of it? Is that something that you thought about when you were cyber director, or could you envision sort of future permutations of that?
Well, thank you. And look, every country organizes its cyber diplomacy a little bit differently. So in the UK, we also incorporated things like sort of digital liberties and supply chain issues. So again, it just varies depending on the structure of, be it a foreign ministry or other bits of government. I think there is actually a healthiness to encompassing other things and cross-pollinating. I think we can learn on thinking about sort of the future of cyberspace through looking at looking across at environmental processes, looking across at other diplomatic processes, And I think there's also, I think it is really important not to overly securitize the agenda, which may sound strange. I'm a securocrat by background, and I still am a securocrat largely. But I think it's hugely important for us to be speaking across those sort of divides between people who work on rights and liberties, people who work on security, and people who work on prosperity or economic growth. Because actually a lot of the actions in one space will have implications for the others. So I think if you're really going to integrate on cyber diplomacy, there needs to be really effective interagency working, but ideally that should be fusing into a lot of the activity. There's one coda where I disagree with myself on that one, which is it's also important to stop forum shopping by some states. Because it's also very tempting if you're a state that is not quite so open to talk about your offensive capabilities, talk about the legal or ethical constraints you might operate within, or even own up to activities that you've done. The temptation to reach for a forum that's going to most suit your purposes is going to be there, and the temptation to drag issues from one forum to another is also going to be there. So there's a little bit of diplomatic jiu-jitsu that's required just to kind of track what is going on where, but also connect the dots. So it's unity and separation. I'm sounding like a sort of Californian New Age guru, aren't I? But I think the organizational politics of how governments do this is hugely important. And that's a bit that often gets lost in the ether. People love talking about the policy. They love talking about going to international negotiations, even if it's on Zoom. But the hard wiring of what talent do you need in government, how do you need to organize, and what capability and effect do you need to have as a government is often the sort of the missing ingredient. And I would argue that's a challenge for all of us, thinking incredibly about what we want to do to support our democratic countries.
Thank you, Alexander. We only have just a few short minutes here remaining. On organizational politics, Michele, maybe just give you the last word on this for 1 or 2 minutes, because there is a lot of thinking, as you know, about the State Department, and we have a question here about the right way to sort of think about the structure of the State Department. There's some talk of creating a new bureau or elevating the work of the office that you've built. Without getting too much in the weeds here or the politics of it, what is the right way in your view as you think about, just sort of elevating cyber diplomacy, the right way to do that within state or the USG as a whole?
I'm sorry, I have to take the fifth on this. Our new deputy, Wendy Sherman, was just confirmed yesterday, and the secretary has asked her to preside over a 60-day review process. Obviously, there are contemplated more issues than just cyber associated, but this emerging tech can be either narrowly scoped or widely scoped, and I have no idea what they're going to do with that. The only thing I would say, again, as a lapsed decision theorist, organizational behavior person, and somebody who has been in the State Department for almost 38 years, and has been through 8 administrations now and have seen varieties of organizations within it. I think my only imperative is that after all these years, and I've been carrying cyber for 24 years, and until 2011, I did it without an office to do it out of in the State Department. That the only thing that is truly important is that it becomes institutionalized within the State Department as a line of foreign policy making and implementation. That there are obviously in 240 years very few new issues, but this issue obviously, and certainly this year of pandemic has underscored it profoundly, it is truly important, and how it may manifest itself over time can be accommodated in a well-structured entity within the State Department. Obviously, I have a bias. I deal with state-on-state activities. My imperative for my entire career is to prevent harm from coming to the U.S. and to prevent war. I think that remains and is increasingly valid in the cyber context. And I don't want that to be buried in a wide-scoped organizational entity which has pockets of political economy, human rights, and all of that. I mean, the State Department has different bureaus that work together constantly. We're a very cross-cutting thing. And as coordinator for the last 13 years, that's exactly what our office has done. So I just hope for thoughtful, deliberative, and rational decision-making on this issue.
Great. Well, we're out of time. Back to you, Ona. We answered more than we left on the floor, so we'll call that one a success. And thank you so much, Michele and Alexander, for this great conversation.
Oh, well, this is great fun to come back to Yale for something, even though I wish it had been in person.
Next time, for sure.
We really hope that we will bring you both back in person soon. But this was a good substitute. So thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Michele. We're so grateful to you both for doing this. We look forward to gathering in person as soon as that's possible. But until then, this was wonderful. And thanks to everyone who was listening. Join us again in 2 weeks for our final session. We have Thomas Rid joining us to talk about his new book, Active Measures. It's a really spectacular book. He's a lot of fun to talk with. And so we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again and take care. Bye, everyone.
Well,
Alexander.
Alexander.
Nice to see you, Michele. Bye.
Bye, everyone.